Okay, so
we are going straight away into the matter. Well, the first thing I'll do is just to give the floor to my colleague Eugenio Olivares, because he's the main researcher of our research project, and he wanted to make a little bit of shameless publicity. So he's going to start just to give the gist of the program.
Thank you, Luciano. Truth be said, there are two IPs, main researchers in this project, Dr. López-Peláez and myself. Although the idea was originally mine, but I convinced him to come along. The four papers that we are about to present today have to do with this research project, Thomas More and Spain, 16th and 17th centuries ideological and textual construction, funded by the Ministerio de Industria, Economía y Competitividad, which aims to analyze the relations between the English humanist, lawyer and politician Thomas More and the universal monarchy of the first Spanish Habsburgs, Charles I, Philip II and so on, along the 16th and 17th centuries. Within the frame of the Anglo-Spanish relations in this period that I have just mentioned, we believe that Thomas More played a role that came to be highly relevant in the cultural and geopolitical evolution of both communities, the English and the Spanish, or the Spanish and the imperial one, I mean. For this purpose, this project will analyze a wide corpus of historical and literary texts in order to fulfill the following three targets. I'm going to very briefly make reference to each one of them. The first line of research is to clarify the image of the Spanish Empire and the Spaniards that More contributed to build in Tudor England. In More's words and in his personal relations with Catherine of Aragon, Charles V or Juan Luis Vives, a topic that I will be addressing, the English humanist might be perceived as contradictory both as a writer and as a public character. On the one hand, More admires Spanish culture, its military supremacy and its staunch defense of Catholicism, both against Lutherans or Turks. But at the same time, as an Englishman, he sees the Spaniards as the other, both ethnically and culturally. Now, the second line of research is to analyze the impact that More's thought and life had in Spain, particularly after his death in 1535, not only as author and scholar, but also as an icon of religious and political resistance to Protestant England. Quevedo's admiration for the honesty of the Englishman is well known, and so are Jerónimo de Medinilla's partial translation of Utopia, published here in Córdoba, or El Tomás Moro by the humanist Fernando de Herrera. But beyond these names, there is a long list of Spanish scholars and humanists who show a clear Morean influence or a sincere interest in his figure. And the last line of research is aimed at deepening into the genesis of Thomas More's idealization, a process that did not take place only in England or in peninsular Spain, but particularly in the Netherlands, a territory which belonged to the Crown of Spain until the Peace of Westphalia in 1648. It was there that the English Catholics, many of which were More's relatives and friends, took shelter during the 1540s and the 1560s. Also there, the two official biographies of More were composed by authors intimately associated to these circles. Around More's figure, a Catholic identity in the exile and against the Tudors was built in the Netherlands. So these are the three lines of research of the present project, and we will be addressing some of these issues.
Well, now it's my turn, and then I would like to present briefly. just the main questions that we have submitted to this panel that, as you can see, have to do. It's a kind of a kind of splitting into different parts of our project. So basically, we will try to answer those questions. Textual and ideological portrayal of truth by Thomas More during the 16th and the 17th century, the influence of the humanist and the state that humanist played in Spain and England as well. And then, well, the questions are up to what, what is the scope and depth of Thomas More? What place did Spain occupy in Thomas More's personal and ideological thought? Which Spanish and Spanish texts were influential in the perception of Thomas More in Spain? What was the exact impact of utopia as well in Spain? And then what is also the connection between Thomas More and the English Jesuit colleges, both in the Low Countries and in Spain, more particularly in the Valladolid college there. And then what is the exact relationship between Morean humanism and Spanish humanism? Fernando de Herrera perhaps is instrumental in this sense. How did the circles of political power in Spain accepted, transformed, manipulated, and assimilated the influence of Thomas More, that was not only humanist, but was an important icon as a political and religious figure. Another question as well is to gauge up to what point, to calibrate, up to what point the ideas of Thomas More were more or less orthodox, and then how it was in a way distorted by the anti-Erasmian current in Spain. This is, as you can see, of course, also the figure of Arias Montano and the cumulative bias that how was religiously taking the figure of Thomas More. And then, well, in relationship with the English Catholic martyrs. And then, which specific documents promoted the introduction and the figure of Thomas More in Spain. I have personally researched so far the first introduction of Thomas More in Spain, that is Fernando de Herrera's Tomás Moro, which is a kind of biography. This is an important document, and then in a first instance we can see how Fernando de Herrera have modified the figure of Thomas More, basing himself in the sources of that time, that were basically in Latin, because of course the people at that time, the Spanish, did not speak English, but there were three important documents in Latin that were known by Fernando de Herrera. One of them is Nicholas Sanders, which is the introduction of the English, it is in Latin, sorry. Let me see.
The origine
progressus systematis Anglicani, that is. Then the second is the one by Thomas Stapleton, which is, and then of course what is Tres THOME as well, which is and it is the life of the three Thomases of the time. San August, Thomas Aquinas. Thomas of Aquinas, also Thomas Becket and Thomas More. And then also Pedro de Rivadeneyras, the Historia Ecclesiástica del Cisma de Inglaterra. Those sources were known to him, but we don't know Fernando de Herrera really knew something about the utopia, because he doesn't mention utopia in his account. There is the debate as whether it is a biography or it is an essay, or one of the first essays in European culture. And another important thing that we can see there is how, if we compare that account of the life of Thomas More with the previous life by William Roper, who was the son-in-law of Thomas More, or Nicholas Hatfield. They both write the earliest biographies. Then we can see how it had been transformed into something different when we come to Spain. We can see how the political, religious, and in general cultural horizon influenced the way in which Thomas More suffered a first sea change, just to quote Shakespeare. There are more interesting things as well. We know that there was a connection with Thomas More in Seville, because in the library of Fernando Colón, who was the son of Christopher Columbus, Ferdinand Colón, then he left a library to the city of Seville, and in that library there is an issue in Latin, of course, of the Utopia. There was also two issues of the Epigrammata by More and Erasmus, and then there was also an issue which at present day is at the University of Seville, of the Omnia Latina opera, so that they might have been read by Fernando de Herrera as well. We know also that in the general ambience of the Catholicism appropriation of Thomas More, or defense of Thomas More, there were several manuscripts. La Historia de los Mártires de la Cartuja by Fray Alfonso de la Torre, which was a Carthusian in the monastery of Nuestra Señora de la Cueva, and he specifically mentions Thomas More as a martyr. And then we have also, less probably, Cristóbal Tamariz has also, was also a friar of the, and then she composed a kind of song, or poetry, or poem in 6 cantos, but he doesn't mention Thomas More. Also, the works in Latin of Thomas More were well known here, and what we can say, this is my line of research now, is how this transformation went on along the century. And even if we go a little beyond the 17th century, we can see that the influence of the utopia, in this case, was present in Spain in the ideas of the enlightened politicians and intellectuals of the people. More specifically, there is a certain influence in the only utopic writing or book in Spanish, which is called Sinapia. Sinapia is really, in the same way as the Utopia, is the reverse of Hispania. So that you can see the relationship, and there are many more relationships. It is the work of an anonymous author, but appeared in the library of the Count of Campomanes, who was one of those illustrious enlightened people. And then we know that Olavide, as well, the intendente of the Nuevas Poblaciones, Pablo Olavide, he visited and he had free access to the library of Campomanes, and then he seems to have read also the Utopia of Thomas More, and this is an interesting thing, in French. because the issues, the translations of the first translation into Spanish was a censored one that was incomplete, but in French was there. And just to finish, there are another questions that we can address later if you want, but just to finish, an interesting thing is that in the foundation, this is really what I should have mentioned here. Sorry. I thought I had been missed. But the idea is that in the so-called new settlements that were a series of towns, new towns that were founded in the second half of the 18th century, and they were new towns, as I say, that were founded under the patronage of Charles III, and with the active participation of Pablo de la Vide and the Count of Campomanes and many other enlightened people, which gave the results of the towns like La Carolina in Jaén or La Carlota in Córdoba and La Luciana in Seville. There was also a strong influence of this utopic thought, so that in the so-called fueros de las nuevas poblaciones, we can find a lot of ideas that ultimately can be referred to the utopia. And that's all for my part. And now I give the floor again to you, and then you can continue with your...
Thank you, Luciano. Right. My intervention has to do with... I will try to make explicit reference to the relation that existed in between Thomas More and three well-known characters in Spanish history. These three characters are the Queen of England, Catherine of Aragon, her nephew, Charles V, the Emperor of Europe, and the Spanish humanist Juan Luis Vives. As far as I know, these are the three Spaniards with whom Thomas More might be said to have had a close relationship. When Catherine of Aragon arrived in England on the 2nd of October 1501, she entered into the city of London. She was about to marry the heir to the throne of England, Arthur. An exceptional witness of this event was a young lawyer named Thomas More. Catherine was almost 16 years old, and More described the royal parade to his friend John Holt in a letter written in Latin, of which I will read part of the translation. Catherine, says More, the illustrious daughter of the King of Spain and bride to our distinguished prince, lately made her entry in London amid a tremendous ovation. Never, to my knowledge, has there been such a reception anywhere. But the Spanish escort, good heavens, what a sight! If you had seen it, I am afraid you would have burst with laughter. They were so ludicrous. Except for three, or at the most four of them, they were just too much to look at. Hunchbacked, undersized, barefoot pygmies from Ethiopia. If you had been there, you would have thought they were refugees from hell. Refugees from hell. Inferis evasisse is the word in Latin. But the lady, says More, take my word for it, she thrilled the hearts of everyone. So you have this double side of Thomas More perception of Spain that I was making reference before. admiration for the Spanish monarchy as staunch defenders of Christianity, but at the same time a perception on Spaniards in general terms as different, ethnically different from the English. Well, you know that the marriage in between Catherine and Arthur the Prince of Wales did not last much, and because the heir, the Prince of Wales, died soon after the marriage, and for 7 years after the death of her husband, she had to manage and survive in England against all odds. At some point, Henry VIII accepted the invitation of his father, the future Henry VIII accepted the invitation of his father, Henry VII, to marry the Spanish princess, the widow. As you know, this would have later on consequences. Henry VIII and Catherine did get married in 1509, and she was crowned Queen of England together with Henry on 24th June that same year. Thomas More wrote a Latin poem to celebrate this long-expected ceremony. In his praise of the new queen, he makes also passing reference to Charles' mother, Juana, also known as Juana la Loca. This lady prince, says More in this Latin poem, addressing or referring to Catherine, this lady prince vowed to you for many years, through a long time of waiting, remained alone for love of you. Meaning that since the death of the Prince of Wales and the new marriage, a long time had elapsed. Really, Queen Isabella and Ferdinand wanted her back, but Henry VII did not want to lose that link with the Spanish crown, so she remained there, and eventually she was betrothed and married Henry VIII. According to More's first biographer, William Roper, the Englishman, Thomas More, was devoted to the Queen. Henry would ask More to come and visit him and his wife for the pleasure they had when talking to him, to Thomas More. So much so that the future Chancellor asked his monarch not to call him so often because he had to take care of his family. He was a family man and he had to spend a lot of time at the court, but only as much as necessary. Catherine also tried to convince Thomas More to translate into English Juan Luis Vives' De Institutione Feminae Christianae, a text composed initially for the education of Mary, the future Mary Tudor, but More kindly rejected the invitation, but had the work translated by his disciple, Richard Hare, which actually published a translation of this text into English. This paradise, this kind of everlasting happiness, this harmony would change after Henry VIII, already by 1527, was convinced that his marriage with Catherine was not valid. From then onwards, the Tudor would try to make the Pope officially declare that there has never been a marital union between himself and the Spanish princess. Charles V, new ambassador, Chapuis, as soon as he arrived into England, described Thomas More with the following words: "The father and protector of your Majesty's subjects." From his very arrival at London, Chapuis tries to present Thomas More as a kind of spy, might be too hard, as a kind of infiltrate, as a kind of imperial infiltrate in the Tudor court, presenting him always as having a favorable opinion of the Queen, which was the case, but also of the Emperor Charles V and of the interests of the empire. But this was not the case. More firmly believed that Catherine was Henry's true wife, but would always remain loyal to the interest of England and his king. Although More would never utter his opinion on the so-called great matter, he certainly did not hide his sympathies for the Queen, so much that, as Chapuis again wrote on September the 20th, the Chancellor, I hear, Chapuis says, has spoken so much in the Queen's favour that he has had a narrow escape of being dismissed. A month later, More's position was getting more and more uncomfortable. It is said that the Chancellor is said in danger of being dismissed, and this solely, Chapuis goes on, because he hesitated to sign with the others the King's letters to the Pope, of which Your Majesty has been advised. The situation More could not cope with anymore, and on May 1532 he resigned to his position as Lord Chancellor. There are no records that he ever met again the Queen. There are records of, in the state papers and the calendars and letters of Henry VIII, there are news about the Queen Catherine's reaction at the execution of Thomas More and Bishop Fisher. I've already made reference to More's link with the Emperor. This is a picture of Charles V, 2 years before the execution of Thomas More, 1533. It is interesting to call the attention on the audience on the fact that Thomas More's most famous book, The Utopia, begins with a reference to Charles. In the translation he says, "The most invincible King of England, Henry, the 8th of that name, who is distinguished by all accomplishments as a model monarch, had certain weighty matters recently in dispute with His Serene Highness Charles, Prince of Castile. With a view to their discussion and settlement, he sent me as a commissioner to Flanders." This political mission that Thomas More had to fulfill, commanded by the king, provides the historical, so to speak, scenario for the composition of the Utopia. When this work was published in 1616, Charles was 15 years old, and he was already the Prince of Castile, the Archduke of Austria, the Duke of Burgundy, and Brabant. But for Thomas More, he was simply, or he might be simply, his queen's nephew. For, as you know, Charles was the son of Juana, who was Catherine's sister. Soon enough, by 1518, Charles was already the King of Spain and also the Emperor of Europe. I would like to briefly make reference to different historical moments which might, in which a real meeting in between Thomas More and Charles V might have taken place. Because I have already published 3 long papers on this issue in the magazine Moreana, I don't want to go through again. So let me just point out that More met Charles in 1520 when the Emperor first visited England. He also met the Emperor later on the next year, 1521, at Bruges, and More was again on a diplomatic embassy. And the third and probably last time that More met the Emperor was in 1522 on occasion of Charles V's second visit to England. which had as an immediate consequence that war was declared on France. 3 more episodes, 3 more anecdotes that I would like to refer, because I know Luciano is getting nervous at this point. There was a strong possibility that King Henry VIII would have sent Thomas More to come to Spain as ambassador, especially following the advice of Thomas Wolsey. Thomas Wolsey's relationship with Thomas More was one of hatred and friendship, but it seems that Wolsey at that point was enjoying More's company any longer, so he said the best thing we could do with More is to send him to Spain. When Thomas More got to know about this possibility, he was scared to death, because he went to meet the king and said to him, Your Majesty, well, this is not a quotation, but maybe this might be Thomas More's real words. Maybe, Your Majesty, if you send me to Spain, you are sending me to my grave. Because Thomas More was terribly afraid of 2 things: the Spanish weather and the Spanish food. Eventually, Thomas More never came to Spain, unfortunately for us, but the ambassador that was sent in his place actually died here in Spain when crossing the Spanish meseta. He was so...
Of a Spanish belly.
Well, it seems that it was due to the heat, because he was crossing the meseta in August. When Thomas More was sent to prison after his long refusal to take the oath on the Act of Succession and the Act of Supremacy, the imminence of his death was obvious at some point, but also the imminence of a possible invasion of the imperial troops of England. There were plans that prepare for the imperial generals, some of them at least, to invade and conquer England, but Charles V eventually decided not to do so because he wanted to retain England as an ally. The ending of this section has to do with Charles V's words when he came to know about the execution of Thomas More, Sir Thomas Eliot. Sir Thomas Eliot is the person to whom Charles V is supposed to have said the following words. Well, it is too true, and this will we say, that if we had been master of such a servant, if I had been myself the lord of such a servant as Thomas More, of whose doings ourselves have had this many years no small experience, we would rather have lost the best city of our dominions than have lost such a worthy counsellor. I still have to make reference to Juan Luis Vives, but
well, we can discuss that later.
All right.
All right. Because I would like to give the floor now to our burgeoning scholar.
Sorry. She's sitting there because we
don't see. Inmaculada Ureña Asensio, she has been researching in the translations of the Utopia into Spanish, which was highly prized and perhaps started by Toledo and was actually done by Eugenio. She will discuss something on this.
Thank you, Luciano. And following what Luciano has addressed on the impact and reception of Thomas More in Spain, I would like to make reference to Francisco de Quevedo, because he read and he also wrote about the Chancellor himself in the 16th century. In relation to to Quevedo, I would like to also make a connection or link it to the translation, the first translation published of Utopia in Spain, called La Utopía de Tomás Moro, which was done by the courtier Jerónimo de Medinilla, and it was published here in Córdoba in 1637 in the workshop of Salvador de Cea. I'm going to raise the question, which is the connection between Quevedo and this work? Within my participation, I'm going to address three possible reasons for this. The first of all, one of the reasons why Quevedo is linked to this translation might be the relationship he had with the author of the work, with Medinilla himself. We find that Quevedo kept correspondence with the Andalusian courtier Sánchez Sandoval from the years 1635 up to 1645, and within these letters he references Medinilla in several occasions to comment on his labor as a corregidor here in the city of Córdoba, and also other political labors. Moreover, I have to mention that Quevedo and Medinilla had some friends in common, which were the humanists, Bartolomé Jiménez Patón and also Fernando Ballesteros y Saavedra. These three authors, Jiménez Patón, Ballesteros y Saavedra and Jerónimo de Medinilla, were said to be part of an intellectual circle in the area, the so-called area of Campo de Montiel, and what they used to meet, discuss and prepare their works. There are some writings that refer that Quevedo and Jiménez Patón had a good relationship, so maybe throughout the character of Jiménez Patón, Quevedo met Medinilla. Also, the second reason give for this possible connection, it's also that Quevedo prepared a brief text for the preliminaries of the translation titled Noticia, Juicio y Recomendación de la Utopía y de Tomás Moro. I have to say this translation presents a wide range of paratext, moving from dedications to poems, testimonies, and also different official documents. In this interesting document, Quevedo explains that he was the one who encouraged Medinilla to prepare this translation, and I read the quote. Por esto, viendo yo a don Jerónimo Pretorio de Medinilla y Porres, que le llevaba por compañía en los caminos y le tenía por tarea en las pocas horas que le dejaba descansar la obligación de su gobierno de Montiel, referring to the translation, le importuné a que hiciese esta traducción, asegurándome el acierto de ella, lo cuidadoso de su estilo y sin afectación. We find that not only he motivated him to render the text, but also he took care of revising and also checking the translation so the final product was high quality. Therefore, this fact that fostered Quevedo's interest in making a Spanish translation of Utopia could be related to the important time gap from the time in which Tomás Moro published Utopia in 1516 and this translation, which was like 1 century later. For instance, I have to mention two important facts. On the one hand, that for instance, the English translation was released in 1551, the German one in 1524, and the French Utopia in 1550. So why there wasn't a Spanish translation until 1637. Also, an important fact is that it's interesting how Quevedo proposed this project to Medinilla, because maybe he considered Medinilla to be a good translator because he had worked with Bartolomé Jiménez Patón, who was his master, and so he learned the right techniques and he acquired enough knowledge to translate. I mean, in other words, that he was prepared enough to make this translation. Also, within this document, we find that Quevedo enhances the figure of Thomas More, and I have taken two quotes from the text. Yo me persuado que fabricó aquella política contra la tiranía de Inglaterra. Here Quevedo refers to his admiration for More's bravery to write Utopia and publish it. And also the other quotation was, y verá cuántos méritos tuvo su muerte para canonizar las alabanzas de su vida y de su doctrina. Here somehow Quevedo is trying to criticize how unfair was More's execution, because his actions and his deeds were not as bad as to be executed. The final point I want to raise is that Quevedo owned a copy of Utopia. Probably it was the 1548 version. Moreover, we see that Book 1 appears annotated by himself. This copy is available at the National Library. In relation to the translation, we could guess that Medinilla might have used this copy as a short test for the translation. Also, we find that Quevedo quotes a fragment of Utopia, a brief fragment from Book 1, in his work Carta a Luis XIII, and he does it in Spanish instead of Latin, which was the actual language of the Utopia. I mean that Quevedo was the translator of this brief fragment of Utopia, and maybe that was the starting point of the reason why he might be motivated to prepare or to address Medinilla to prepare a translation. We cannot forget to mention that La Utopía de Tomás More only included book 2 translated. Maybe Quevedo did not trigger it, or he wasn't interested at all in book 2, but the author could have taken care that there were any reference to book 1, because it was said it had an Erasmian spirit. We have to mention that few sentences from this section appear in the index Et Catalogus Librorum Prohibitorum of 1583. Also, other reason that may be affected for for leaving book 1 untranslated is that maybe Medinilla preferred to leave aside the tedious work of translating a philosophical dialogue and just got straight to the moral proposals. To conclude, the figure of Thomas More could be said to be highly admired by Quevedo, also by Jerónimo de Medinilla, but nevertheless it is not done from a religious perspective, but instead of, but from a moral and political one. According to Quevedo's views, Thomas More was a role model to be imitated by Spaniards, and more specifically by Spanish politicians. The situation of Spain was critical due to the political and economic crisis, and if Utopia was used as an inspirational source for the government, the country would improve. In brief, he materialized his desires by means of Medinilla's work, and since then he made Utopia available for everyone. The last part I would like to comment on is that the contribution or the impact that this work had could be relevant because we find there were 2 editions, one in 1790 and another one in 1805. Now Jesús López-Peláez is going to continue with his... Yes.
Somebody makes the word go wrong.
The permission of the calendar, I will be standing up. Okay, I will be talking about money. for reasons I ignore, the economic dimension of the early modern period has not been studied as much as many other elements, theological or metaphysical, philosophical, social, political. And so in our project, I'm trying to explore that dimension, the point to which money and economic concerns are part of Thomas More's work, and more specifically Thomas More's Utopia. So I would like to start today with introducing some major economic concepts in the early 16th century, because it is from these general ideas of how economy was considered in the late medieval, early modern period that we will understand to what extent Thomas More recovers, explores, problematizes, and contributes to those ideas. So this is a very basic overview. Some of you perhaps know something about this, but I think it is necessary. I would like to start with a Renaissance saying, pecunia pecuniam non parere potest, which basically means that money cannot generate more money, that money cannot breed. This is what Martin Luther said in a very famous essay on usury, and he repeated in another infamous essay against the Jews. Money cannot make money. You cannot produce money with money. Money is not an animate entity. So basically, what this flatly denies is the possibility of lending money at interest or profit making. Of course, this was qualified by considerations that I will not get into here of productive and unproductive lending. Unproductive lending was one thing, productive lending was a different thing. It depended on that whether money lending was admitted or not. But in general, it was denied. Of course, this leads to the notions of credit, interest, and loans. Lending money and making money out of that. There are different kinds of loans. Loans of cities and loans of princes, and both have different characteristics, which I will not deal with. And of course, there were other ways of acquiring, of making capital, of making money, like forced loans, the sale of crown lands, the sale of titles and dignities. Very important, the farming out of taxes, which in Spain we call juros, the farming out of taxes. Currency depreciation, which is something I will return, which is basically debasing money. When coins were made of gold, the governments had the possibility of taking some of the gold away and making or trying to make the coin to keep the face value. But it didn't work because merchants and tradesmen didn't like those new coins with less gold. So it produced more problems than it actually solved. But in general, money is very important in the early modern period. This sounds like a very obvious statement that money is important, but it wasn't so in the late medieval one, because we are in a transition from dealing in kind, bartering, changing stuff. I give you cereal, you give me an ox or something, and dealing in money. I would like to quote a German, there's always a German involved, a German economic historian, Richard Ehrenberg, who said, and I quote, never since the time of the Roman Empire had everything been so easily bought with money as in the early 16th century. So money is very rapidly becoming the only way to purchase goods and to do things. Greed for money, this is what Ehrenberg calls it. Of course, money was also problematic, not only because of this greed for money, but also because it opened a gap, a distance between value and worth, which were two different things, and people started to realize that they were different things. Also importantly, in another Renaissance famous saying, pecunia nervus belli, which basically means money is the sinews of war. Money is the backbone of war, which means not that wars are fought for money, but that if you don't have money, you cannot wage a war. kings realized that they increasingly needed capital to finance wars, especially if the wars were abroad, foreign wars, as in the case of Spain, for example. Well, Machiavelli didn't agree with this, but Machiavelli had this thing of every time he saw something that many people believed in, he tried to go against that. But the proto-liberal thinker, Giovanni Botero, was one of the advocates of these ideas. Now the problem, of course, was that the feudal military system that was working in the medieval period had a weakness. And people realize now that it had a weakness. It relied on a feudal contract. So the vassal, the subject, could break that contract if he perceived that the lord was not fulfilling his duties. So kings and lords started to realize that they needed to rely on, it started in Italy, and they called them condottieri, and then they became mercenaries. So mercenary wars, for which you needed money, became predominant. And that ready money, that cash, was most of the times gold. So gold becomes, in a way in which it had not during the medieval times, during the Middle Ages, becomes the center of attention of everybody. And of course, in the case of gold, Spain plays a major role. Because even during the lifetime of Thomas More, Spain was starting to introduce huge amounts of gold, later silver, but initially gold, into Europe. Through Seville, through Spain, but into Europe in general. One of the problems with value is, one of the problems with gold is that it was perceived to have an intrinsic value. Unlike other things, it was believed that gold never changed. Then, English-speaking scholars will tell you that it was Jean de Bodin, the French thinker. But we today know that they were the people from the school of Salamanca, the first who realized that the value of gold also changed. That gold didn't have a fixed, immutable value. So that was another problem that people had to cope with. And of course, as I mentioned before, devaluation, the debasing of currency, there were different practices. When you had a gold coin, you could do a number of things, like sweating, for example. Frictioning the coins one against the other so that you get some gold dust, and you keep the gold dust and then you send the coin away. But all these had consequences, very, very important consequences. But the most important thing here, okay, it should be here. Anyway, I will return to that, but the most important thing about gold is the opposition to hoarding, which means amassing the gold, keeping the gold at home. During the Middle Ages, it was believed that this was the way to become a wealthy kingdom, to keep the gold, never use it, never give it away. But by the time Thomas More is writing Utopia, this is not the case. People are starting to realize that gold has to go round, to circulate, in order to produce more wealth. Well, the importance of foreign trade, and these three notions, I don't have time to go into any of them, they are slightly different, Bullionism, mercantilism and protectionism, but they are important. We could say that Thomas More was a mercantilist thinker, although there are some qualifications to that, and we will have to go into different kinds of mercantilism to explain what kind of mercantilist Thomas More was. Anyway, what about economic ideas in Thomas More's Utopia? Of course, we have colonialism, we have trade and the distribution of goods, we have credit as opposed to cash or ready money, we have usury, we have gold, we have hoarding as opposed to, as I said, the use and the circulation of capital, we have private property, and we have war. All these topics, which are very directly connected to some major central ideas in the economic thought of the 16th century, appear in Utopia. But interestingly, Eugenio, Professor Olivares was referring before to Moreana. Moreana is the unofficial Journal of Thomas More Studies in the World? Well, only like 3% of the works, of the articles published in Moreana in the last 50 issues, like 3% deal with economy. So this is something that has been neglected for some reason. I have a personal idea of why this is, but I will go into that. But anyway, even though utopia is a strongly economically oriented work, and I disagree now here with my colleague. He mentioned that utopia opens with a political embassy. Well, it's not a political embassy, it's an economic embassy, as you will know. Thomas More goes to the continent. The Thomas More of Utopia, the character Thomas More, goes to the continent to negotiate trade agreements. So Utopia is, from the beginning, obsessed with economy and with trade and with money. Okay, before we get there, I don't know how much time do I have? 5 minutes?
There's no,
yeah,
we need
okay.
a minute and a half.
Just a couple of ideas. Book 1 of Utopia describes two major problems, as we know, of English and European society. The two major problems are war, this is what Raphael Hitler explains in Book 1, and economic injustice. As we have seen, both are interrelated. This is the phrase I mentioned, pecunia nervus belli. War and economic injustice, or economy, are connected. More focuses in Utopia as, on money as the root of evil. Raphael Hitler explains in Book 1, and I quote from Book 1, as long as cash money, well, this is a translation, English, modernized English translation, as long as cash money, or ready money, is the measure of all things, it is really not possible for a nation to be governed justly or happily. So if you have money, if money is, as Richard Edinburgh said, the central thing in the minds of people, there's no justice. Consequently, utopian society is a moneyless society in which people trade in kind. So this is why some people say that utopia is a medievalist, nostalgic work, because it looks like it's trying to go backwards. In the Thomas More from Utopia, the fictional character, and also Raphael Hitler provide several reasons why the existence of money does not contribute to the welfare of the realm. And I will just quote one thing, and I leave you with the emblem. This is what he says, Book 1. Suppose the councillors of some other king are discussing various schemes for raising money to fill his treasury. And suppose that the councillors are thinking, what can we do to get some money for the kingdom? One man recommends increasing the value of money when the king pays his debts and devaluing it when he collects his revenues. Thus he can discharge a huge debt with a small payment and collect a large sum when only a small one is due to him. What is Hitler talking about? He's talking about tampering with money. He's talking about devaluing the currency. This is a very modern economic idea that many governments have done. One of the problems with the euro in the European Union today is that governments cannot do this kind of thing. The stability of the currency preoccupied scholars all over Europe, and state control was perceived as wrong and useless. This is what happened in England in 1540, when Henry VIII made something called the Great Debasement, which was a disaster, but was basically that. Tampering with the value of the coin. In Spain, of course, it was a major issue, a very central problem, because Spain was the first country to be hit by the effects of monetary instability because of the affluence of gold from the Indies. So I will end with an emblem from the Jesuit Andrés Mengo and his book, Príncipe Perfecto y Ministros Ajustados, in which he dedicates emblems to economy, and one of them, emblem 47, which is the one I'm going to show you, reproduces the image of a coin showing Emperor Constantine, Roman Emperor Constantine, the one who introduced Christianity as the state religion. He's kneeling in front of a coin with an inscriptio which says Monete probitas et veneratio, which means excellence and veneration of money. But It doesn't mean that the emperor is adoring, worshipping pagan-like way money or coins. Rather than suggesting that, what the emblem, Mendo's emblem shows is like in Hitler's example, that to interfere with the value of coins disturbs trade and disrupts the realm. He says, Mendo in the emblem, con el comercio se conserva la abundancia y para él es necesaria la buena ley en la moneda. In other words, through trade, plenty is kept, and it is for trade that no deviation from legal standard is required. Okay.
Okay, thank you for your attention. We still have half an hour for discussion, so you can ask any question or we can discuss among ourselves as well. So, is there any question? Or
just from what Jesús has said, I really like your presentation and I find it very interesting. What I don't see is how it gets in the project of More and Spain. Are these ideas were they influential in Spain or commented or criticized or anything?
Well, there are two ways to answer that. two reasons why. You don't see, and you're right, seeing the obvious direct link. Huh? One is that I decided I wanted to start with this general overview of economy because I haven't made the effort of seeing how many of the presentations in this idea deal with money or economy. I guess not very many. Huh? So I thought it would be interesting to start with this general introduction. So I didn't have the time to go into that in any detail. Now, the second thing is that I do not think that there's, or at least I haven't found a direct influence from Thomas More into Spain in economic concern. What I believe is that there was a general European structure of feeling in economic terms that influenced both Spanish thinkers like Mendo, although Mendo is quite later than it's like 80 years after Thomas More, but some others, and English scholars. Thomas More, of course, and some other people like Geoffrey Whitney or Edmund Spencer. So there was this general trend that connects utopia's concerns with economy, with the problems that an unbalanced economy may produce, with the concerns with how this early modern period, this new age, has very strange alterations in things like value and worth, for example. How now it's no longer desirable to hoard money, but what you have to do is to make it go round, to circulate it. These two things are important in the economic and epistemological thought in Spain and in England. What is interesting is that Thomas More saw or perceived some of these things before they were completely evident in Spain. So I would not postulate a cause and effect kind of relation. Like Thomas More wrote this, and this is what Spain did. Well, because utopia was not well known in Spain in the 1520s, 1530s. The school of Salamanca was, I don't know if they were aware of what he had already said in Utopia. But what I perceive, what I find, is that they share in this same or similar preoccupation with money.
Thank you.
Perhaps there is a relationship with the fact that when it was translated, Utopia was translated into Spanish, the first part was not translated because, well, there might be other reasons, but this is the part in which there is a stark criticism of money and and then also of the royal authority and wars and all that.
Well, there's a stronger criticism in book 1, but book 2 is also very much into presenting this moneyless society. And there's a very clear criticism. Hitler explains how it is terrible, he says, that some kings keep the gold for themselves and they don't use it. I had another emblem by Geoffrey Whitney in which he presents a king drowning rather than using his wealth to save himself. So how stupid, how foolish it is to keep your gold and not make it go round and make it profitable. This is what we have read in Spencer. I think it's book 2, I think, from the Fairy Queen, with Bouillon, when he finds Mammon, who hides in a cave with all the treasures and all the golds, and he doesn't make it go round, so it is useless. And for the first time in history, this is perceived to be evil. And Utopia also participates in that.
Now, in this respect, also, I would like to add that it should be necessary to contextualize that thought, general thought on money, within the general utopic thought, because we must not forget that Utopia was followed by a series of utopic texts, for instance, Fray Tommaso de Campanella, The City of the Sun, even Bacon as well, Roger Bacon, The New Atlantis, although it is unfinished and then it doesn't really deal much with those questions. We have even something that Sinapia itself, and in all those texts, money does not exist or is highly criticized, so that there is, I would say, a kind of proto-naive communism, in the sense that could be related to evangelical ideas, so having to, but then, I mean, after all, there is also a communitarian identity as well. I think all the utopic texts, and I don't know if I left some texts, but basically Tommaso Campanella, The New Atlantis as well, and then the Sinapia. And well, even in Tommaso Campanella's, he promotes, he justified the common sharing of women, of wives, for reproductive reasons, of course. You know? Well, but coming again to money, money is or strictly controlled, or just it is ruled out. You know, it is proscribed. So this idea, I think, is important. Not only, and I don't know if it was Thomas More the one that initiated that line of thought, and it was followed by the other utopians, or it is that it was in the air, in the atmosphere of the time.
I have this.
I don't forget you.
Yeah, go ahead.
Back to your question, I was having this conversation with my colleague, Professor López-Peláez, about the possibility that the fact that the utopianos, the utopians, they have gold as a kind of precious metal, and they make jewels and utensils with it, but then they don't use money for buying and selling and all that, but they trade, and eventually they use gold when they want to fight against a neighboring enemy. I was thinking about the possibility that this idea might have come into More's mind through the accounts of the first Spaniards to land in America. The way in which they, obviously not talking about Mexico at the time of Hernán Cortés, or the Incas and Pizarro, which they have gold and they use that for different purposes, artistic purposes and religious purposes. But I mean the primitive communities, and my colleague mentioned the Caribbeans, the type of use that they made of gold. And if we could prove that these accounts got to Thomas More, that would be something. And it would be also a direct link in between Utopia and the Spanish Empire, so to speak.
Now it's your turn.
Well, just a reflection. I was thinking about the economic side of Thomas More's work, Utopia, and I think it's also intimately related to the political side too, because economy and politics are very closely related, as you can see. For example, one of the central criticisms is against corruption, you know, and so the idea of being a society in which there was no money sort of flowing around also prevented corruption, prevented leaders from becoming corrupted. And I think that maybe also if we look back at the sources, maybe that we could also look back at Plato's Republic, which also has the same idea that the leaders should not have money because it is a temptation, you know, for them. So I think that probably in More's Utopia, political and economic questions are intimately related and to form his Utopia. And I was also interested in knowing if in Spain there were also works of similar, for example, Juan Luis Vives, as being a humanist, that I think there were later works, no, that had these ideas, or did Juan Luis Vives also write something similar to More's Utopia?
No, he didn't, but, well, I might go there, but maybe I don't want to. Vives and More were close friends, and Erasmus had introduced one to each other. We have not, there is no extant correspondence in between Vives and More, but we assume that there were letters addressed to each other. So the information that we have about the relationship in between More and Vives comes from the letters that More was sending to Erasmus, making reference to Vives, and Vives to Erasmus, making reference to More. Apart from that, Juan Luis Vives was invited by Thomas Wolsey to lecture at the University of Oxford on rhetorics, I think. So every single time that he went to Oxford, because he was living in the Bruges, the Low Countries, and it was easy for him to cross the Channel and to go to Oxford. Every single time that he went to Oxford, he paid a visit to Thomas More. And there was one, I think it was in 1521, when Vives was a guest at Thomas More's house in Chelsea, and I would love to have been there, because we have these two towers of European humanism talking about the same issues that they were concerned with, the threat of the Ottoman Empire, the Lutheran Reformation, the matter of the King of England trying to marry again. But and there are references, there are explicit references in Vives' works and in Vives' correspondence, not only to Thomas More, but to his daughters. And also, well, this is not what you were asking, but anyway, Vives did not write any kind of work that might be labeled as utopian. He had these ideas about taking care of poor people by building hospitals, or what we might call hospital, to attend people that were moneyless. As much as I know, that is the only writing by Vives that might be said to be utopian. But I mean, they were close friends. They admired each other. In fact, Thomas More says, I am ashamed, in a letter to Erasmus, I am ashamed that such a young man as Vives is writing such good works. And of course, when Thomas More was executed and Thomas Vives was far away, he had been declared persona non grata in England. He was in the Low Countries, and he wrote this book illustrating different ways to write a letter in Latin, how to start a letter and how to end up a letter with the final salutation, so to speak. And one of the examples he gives of a letter to be written, he says, give my best wishes to Thomas More and to his family, and especially to Margaret. Margaret was Thomas More's eldest daughter, and especially to Margaret, whom from the first time I met, I loved her as if she was my sister. This is a kind of melancholical thought on Vives, by Vives, at the time when Thomas More was already dead, gives us a hint of the intimacy that the two humanists had shared.
I can also add that one of the rubs of the difficulties, the shortcomings of Spanish literature concerning utopian or utopic text is that there has not been utopian text. The only utopian and the first have been translated or written as the first utopian text is that Sinapia that appeared in the library of the Count of the Campomanes, and then it is a manuscript. It's not was discovered in 1976, and then there have been a lot of study about that. But apart from that, there might have been text. It seems that there is no the influence of Thomas More was not exerted in that respect.
Now that you mention the manuscript, there is a full translation of Utopia, Book 1 and Book 2. It is at the National Library of Spain.
Where is manuscript?
And from Latin to Spanish, and it has not been published. I know there is someone trying to publish it, because he was sending an article to Moriana, and I was reviewing it. It is an excellent piece of research. Unfortunately, it is written in Spanish, so the impact of this paper might be, in fact, less than it should be. But there is an entire translation of Utopia, as you know yourself as well, with Book 1 and Book 2, probably written shortly after the publication in 1516 of More's Utopia in the Low Countries. Not by More himself, but by Erasmus of Rotterdam. I don't think we have answered all the questions that we posed at the beginning, but so if you want to ask for your money, talk to Jorge.
No, me? No, I don't have money. I am completely moneyless. But we can...
As the Utopians, right?
Am I supposed to close it?
Oh yes.
Well, thank you very much to the speakers and to the audience. It's been a very interesting and thing that we can close this session and congratulate everyone.
Thank you.